welcome all of my lovely attendees to our 315 Word on the Street teen session titled Other Worlds. This is kind of our fantasy discussion session for this afternoon. And joining us for this session, we have two authors. If you have questions for them, there is a Q&A function in our Zoom webinar. You can toss questions in there and I will pose them to the writers as we go along. I do also want to acknowledge that the Lethbridge Public Library and those of us in Lethbridge are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains. We pay respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So things to keep in mind as we gather here today to talk stories, kind of, sort of in Lethbridge, depending on where you are joining us today. So welcome, Adan, and welcome, Tanaz. I'm excited to speak to you about your books, and I hope we get some great questions from the audience. There's one that has come in already. Somebody is super on the ball today. It's very exciting. I just realized I didn't figure out which of you would like to introduce yourself first. Adam, would you like to go first because your name starts with the letter A?
Sure, that works for me. Do the alphabet. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today and talk about fantasy worlds. It's definitely exciting because both of my books came out during COVID, so I haven't gotten to talk to many people. But yeah, my name's Adan. My pronouns are they, them. I'm actually in Kingston right now. And when I'm not writing, which is obviously my favorite thing to do, I'm actually a postdoc at X University, at Ryerson University. They're in the process of changing their name for reconciliation, doing disability studies. But my heart is definitely in fantasy and writing. So, hi, everyone.
Excellent, thank you. And Tanaz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanaz Bhathena. I'm an author based in Mississauga, Ontario. I've written 2 contemporary novels so far, and then suddenly I made a foray into fantasy, and now I can't give up on it. So we'll be discussing 2 of my books today, and I'm really, really excited to talk to you and talk to Adan as well about all these exciting things.
I think this is definitely, I mean, not that all the sessions aren't super fun, but I know we had a lot of people excited about the fantasy session because these are always fun books. I think we'll start off, I'll have each of you do a bit of reading from your books just to give everybody a taste of what your stories and your writing style are like. Normally at the festival, we have a big tent where people can go and buy books from the University of Lethbridge bookstore. Obviously, because we're all just, hanging out in our living rooms and whatnot, that isn't exactly possible this year. However, the U of L bookstore does have books from all of our Word on the Street authors available for purchase this year. And they will be very speedy with delivery because of that. You can just do a search on the University of Lethbridge website for their bookstore, and then find all of the authors that we have this afternoon, and you can buy their books and enjoy them at home. Adam, would you like to go first for the excerpt presentation?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'll just say that in my books, I have them both here. The covers are beautiful. The designer did an amazing job. There are 2 worlds. There's the human world, and then there's the secondary magic witches world, which was obviously very fun to create. And there are 3 main characters in these stories. There's Eli, who's a human, who's part human and also is an assassin who's made from all different kinds of materials, very sort of magical. And then there's Tav, who's a human, and then there's Kite, who is a witch and is from the witch's planet. So I'm reading from the second book, The Boy of Feather and Steel, and I'm reading a Kite section. I bring a message for the air dormant. An underling appeared, a witch acolyte adorned in frail streamers of fabric, gauzy and pale, almost like smoke moving through the room. Low magic, a nobody. Kite was surprised they had been able to find her. Most were too afraid of the tomes in the library, the ancient books swollen with malice. Kite looked up, blinking, an opalescent tear sliding down her nose and onto the book before her. Her hair was piled like a waterfall on her head. The Witch Lord has requested an audience. Kite bowed her head, causing tentacles of hair to fall over her face, unrolling across the floor. When had her hair grown so long? She had no concept of time. Thank you for telling me. Her voice was musical, the lilting song of a harp, dangerously gentle. The coven knew she spent most of her time in the library, poring over ancient histories and forgotten magic. The Witch Lord hoped to use her knowledge to increase the coven's power. She had something else in mind. The acolyte left. Kite stared at the lettering underneath her hands. Quickly, Kite ripped the page from its spine, shoved it into her mouth, and chewed, letting the ink run down her tongue. The words would confuse anyone who wanted to know what she had been thinking. Living in the library had its advantages. A sea of words, and she could put them together however she wanted. Kite swallowed. When she smiled, her teeth were stained black. Then she rose and went to see her mother. The room she was summoned to was dark, but Kite could smell the beast. She sunk onto her knees and bowed her head. She could feel the beast sniffing her out, testing her mind strength, tasting her aura. Then the smell faded, and a small whimper echoed through the chamber. Kite suddenly felt weak. Looking down, she could see her material body peeling away, revealing her magical essence, the aqua light of her being, her true shape, her most powerful and vulnerable body. No one came hidden in skins to an audience with the Witch Lord. Taking a deep, calming breath, Kite closed her eyes the moment before she dematerialized and let herself fall into her true state of being. Naked, she drifted, a furious ball of light in a small prison, before the invisible eyes of the Witch Lord. And then the moment passed, and Kite was in her body once again, her hair slick as seaweed against her face. Pain rocked her body, and she curled up on the floor like a child, waiting for it to pass. A show of strength then, a reminder of what the Witch Lord could do. Unravel her in a moment, steal her skin, reabsorb her power. Welcome, Essence daughter, said the Witch Lord. Lord Mother, whispered Kite. Are you ready to take your rightful place in the coven? Kite scrambled to her knees and bowed again, pressing her forehead into the earth. Her mouth watered at the scent of delicious dirt. It is time, daughter, to declare you heir rising. Excitement bubbled up in Kite, and water dribbled from the corners of her lips. She had been the heir dormant for so long that she had stopped believing the Witch Lord would ever allow her to use her full powers. You have shown loyalty by rejecting the human-touched girl, but there are some in the first ring who still have their doubts. You will dispel their doubts, command their faith and their bodies, and take your place as my right hand in the war against the children abominations who even now rise up against us in acts of treason. Eli, of course. Kite should have known that her attachment to the maid girl had not gone unnoticed. No true witch would befriend an object. And the heir rising was more than a witch, more even than a symbol of the Witch Lord's rule. They were the right hand of the coven. She shared a modicum of the Witch Lord's power. She might even rule distant planets in her mother's stead. It is my honor to serve you, Lord, said Kite. Bring back the heart. It will be done. Swear with your essence and prove your loyalty to me, who was the source of your magic, magic above material. Magic above material, Kite repeated. Again, she found herself stripped of her body, but this time she was not alone. Another essence, glowing white but rainbowed, gleaming different hues of brilliance, so beautiful it hurt, reached out a tendril of light and touched. Kite screamed with no mouth, a soundless prayer of obliteration. When the pain passed, Kite's blue-green essence bled with shades of pink and gold. Kite felt a rush of power burn through her body, and knowledge, sweet and crisp as pear on her tongue. Kite now understood how to steal magic. Bring back the heart, and I will give you more power than you can imagine. Then the Witch Lord was gone. The air lightened, the dark lessened, retreating. The whispering stopped. Kite lay on her back, panting in the dirt, pain pulsing through her body. She rolled over and vomited ink. The beast shuffled forward and started lapping it up. Kite smiled. She had done it. She had become the air rising. Thank you.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Good, sucking in of the audience, I think. Excellent. Tanaz, would you like to share from one of your books?
Sure, absolutely. So I have two books here. So the first one is called Hunted by the Sky, and its sequel, which I'll be reading from today, is called Rising Like a Storm. To give you an idea, this fantasy duology is set in a world inspired by medieval India and follows the story of two teenagers. A girl named Gul, who's prophesied to be a tyrant king's downfall, and a boy named Kavas, who wants to join the king's army to protect his ill father, but instead gets ensnared in Gul's plan for vengeance against the king. In these books, you will find chosen ones, an enemies to lovers romance, fierce female warriors, magical creatures inspired by Indian and Persian mythology, and some very cranky ghosts. So, without further ado, let me start reading from chapter 1 of Rising Like a Storm, and this is in Gul's point of view. When the bounty hunter finds me, I'm squatting behind the partially broken wall of an outdoor restroom in Tavan, bare from the waist down, my skin prickling in the cold light of a yellow half moon. I hear him first, his breaths heavy and ragged, before I catch him peering at me from behind the wall, his gaunt face coated with a layer of shimmering dream dust. His spell nicks the tip of my earlobe, leaving behind a cut that could have severed my whole ear had I not rolled out of the way, my bladder going taut and painful, every urge to urinate gone. A grunt, followed by another spell in the dark. Debris strewn across the wet floor sticks to my palms as I crawl over it. My heart beats out a scattered rhythm as the restroom glows again with red light, more tiles clattering to the ground. I hold in a breath, not daring to make a sound. If only I could get to my daggers. Right now, they're sheathed in my belt, which hangs on the wall, in full view of anyone taking aim from the outside. The star-shaped birthmark on my right arm grows warm. My magic, as always, is the danger I'm in. I know I could fight the bounty hunter magically without my daggers. I also know that by doing so, I could potentially rupture an organ or injure myself in some other stupid way, making it easier for him to take me to Queen Shela and claim the 5,000 swarnas she's offered for my capture. Is someone there? I say under my breath. I'm not looking for an alive someone. Certainly, I'm not hoping to draw the attention of the bounty hunter. But a living specter or two might be lingering nearby. Each chained to our world by a single desperate wish, living specters are spirits of the dead that remain invisible to magi and non-magi. Though everyone can hear and feel the presence of the specters, only half magi like Kavas can see them. Over the past 20 years, Tavan's specters have protected its boundary, circling the golden bars the Pashu King Subodh magically erected to protect the city. The combined powers of the bars and the specters keep the city not only invisible, but also unbreachable by outsiders. So how did a bounty hunter show up here, I wonder? Are the specters fading? Specters could fade, disappearing for good from the living world once their most desperate wish was fulfilled. Without spectral magic, the golden bars can vanish, creating gaps in Tavan's boundary like holes in an aging tapestry. My breath rushes out, a sound that makes the bounty hunter mutter. His looming shadow sways erratically against the bathroom floor. I wonder if he's feeling dizzy, a common after effect of the dream dust. Inhaling too much of the dust can make you question what you see with your own eyes. A solid advantage in my favor right now. But I don't dare look up to confirm this. The bounty hunter is still armed. I can't predict how the dust will affect his aim. I'm not sure about my own aim either. I have practiced death magic once in these 3 months. I've carried my dagger belt everywhere like a shackle binding my hips. A rock clatters outside, followed by a man's enraged shout. I crane my neck up, risking a peek through the hole in the bathroom wall. Instead of the bounty hunter, I see only the night sky, as starry and cloudless as the sky goddess's eyes in my dreams. Are you there, goddess? I think. Can you hear me? But the goddess remains silent, the way she has ever since we arrived in Tavan. A breath brushes my injured ear, sending burning pinpricks over my skin. A childish giggle followed by a familiar sing-songy voice. Wallowing in self-pity again? Shame. What if the Legion saw their star warrior now? And that is it for the excerpt.
That was also very tempting. Both of you chose wonderful, wonderful bits to pull in our readers. Thank you for that. I guess we could start with a big question to begin with. What drew both of you to writing fantasy? Tanaz, do you want to go first?
Sure. I loved reading fantasy as a child. I was always attracted to stories about witches and werewolves and monsters. Growing up, R.L. Stine was one of my favorite authors. I used to completely devour his stories. And I was basically this Indian kid growing up in Saudi Arabia. And this was in the 90s. So basically, I had very little access to libraries. So back then, I did not know how I could mine my own culture to create fantasies set in an Indian-inspired universe or anything of that sort. I was always, reading about pixies and elves and things like that. So whenever I tried to write or replicate these stories, it would come off, sounding weird, or I didn't really have the resources to look back and read more of these stories. So I sort of transitioned into writing contemporary fiction for many, many years. And then it was not until I was an actual adult that I came across a lot of Indian inspired fantasy, or, fantasy set in India specifically. And that's when I thought to myself, maybe I could do something like that as well. And so that's when the funny story with this particular series was that I started writing a sci-fi dystopia set in a completely made up world, and it was 50,000 words of an utter disaster. So I had to trash the whole manuscript and go back and rewrite. And as I was rewriting, I thought, you know what, I'll just take a risk and I'll set it in an Indian inspired setting. And the minute I started doing that and I combined it with my love of history, Indian history of especially medieval India, everything started falling into place. And suddenly it was as if a door had unlocked and this whole world began unfurling before me. And then this whole story began pouring out.
And Adan, what pulled you into the world of fantasy and made you choose that for writing?
Yeah, I loved fantasy growing up, and I was always imagining being in other worlds and reading lots of fantasy. Although I think all the fantasy books that I read were very straight, right? Very hetero, very cis. So I'm really excited about where the genre has gone. But then in high school, I, started like 8 books that I never finished, and they were all about characters that were basically my friends, but we had magic. and then I went away to university and sort of got away from writing. I wrote some poetry, some short fiction. And it really wasn't until a few years ago doing my PhD, when this is common for PhD students, I was very lonely and actually struggling with depression. And I sort of picked up a YA fantasy book. And since I'm no longer a YA, I didn't think I was allowed to read it, but I thought, oh, nobody's here to watch me. I'm gonna read it. And it was amazing. And I loved it. And suddenly, from when I was like 12 to being, 30, the genre has gotten huge. There's so much more out there. And I just read so many fantastic YA fantasy books. and I loved it. I wanted to live in these worlds, and I wanted to be a part of creating them. And I started writing the first book in my duology, The Girl of Hawthorne and Glass. It started as just a fun writing exercise where I was at a cafe and I wanted to have an assassin. I wanted to have queer love stories. I wanted to have trans characters, and I just started creating. And after a few months, I thought, I think I could make this into a book. And now I can't stop. It's very exciting for me.
Both of you, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, both of you have written, with both of these, they're both duologies. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
That's correct.
Which is lovely, because as much as I love a good trilogy, it's too many books to keep up with. So standalones and duologies make me very, very happy. Also, they take up less space on bookshelves at the library, which also points. Because then I can have more things for the teenagers to find at the library. Is there something that, were your books always planned as duologies, or was it a larger story and that just kind of found natural breaks? What was kind of the inspiration or the reason for that choice? Adam, do you want to go for that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I started The Girl of Hawthorne and Glass with sort of one particular character in mind and thinking about her journey. And as I was writing her story, and the first draft was really exploratory, really beautiful, and really fun, and I just put in everything I wanted, and had to take a lot of things out. And by the time I sort of got to the end of her sort of personal arc, I realized I was telling actually a bigger story. So I would need to have a sequel. And then I decided to make it a duology because, like you, I find trilogies too long and didn't know if I would have the stamina to write a trilogy. So I think successfully explored the bigger issues in the second book. But yes, that's where I went.
Fantastic. Tanaz?
I'm going to be one of those unpopular people who totally planned a trilogy. And I had this idea that I'm going to write this massive epic, which is like in 3 books, or maybe even expand to 4. But what ended up happening is that when I sold the book, it sold as a duology. So suddenly I had to shrink my whole world down. And I had this idea where I would have my characters visit multiple kingdoms. Instead, I confined them to now one kingdom, in a way that was actually kind of good because it allowed me to really focus the story, and it also allowed me to see different aspects and different facets of the kingdom that I was exploring instead of just randomly moving from one place to another. It was really good in that sense because it also allowed me to explore the magic system that I started to develop, and also really go and dig deep into the sorts of characters I had started writing about in the first book. So I think in the end, the duology actually worked really well for both Hunted by the Sky and Rising Like a Storm.
It is a lovely format. I just definitely don't have the attention span to wait for another book. And I lose track of storylines too easily. But that's just a me thing. With writing fantasy, there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, there's a lot that goes into writing any book. But I feel with writing fantasy, you're creating characters and stories as with contemporary books, but then you're also creating worlds, magic systems, all of these other layers that have to work together as a whole to make the story work. What comes first for you? And I guess this plays into as well, are you a planner? Are you a pantser? Do you write outlines, or do you just see where your story and your characters take you? Tanaz, for first go at the question.
Sure. And this varies with book to book. So I have pretty much pantsed certain books. And for those who don't know, pantsing means writing a book without an outline, which is right now, if I think about it, pretty scary. But that's how I'm actually partly an outliner, partly a pantser, because I feel like I do like the stability of plotting, but I also need the freedom of pantsing to really think out and let certain scenes develop. I usually start with a scene and a character because the character is the main thing for me. The character is the first entry line to the world, and it's through their perspective and their eyes that the world expands and grows before my own. So, in the case of Hunted by the Sky and Rising Like a Storm, it started off with one single scene. It really started with this girl seeing her father being murdered. And that kind of led into the entryway of this world, which was this kingdom of Umber, where this king was basically hunting girls with star-shaped birthmarks because one of them was prophesied to be his downfall. So that's how it started. And typically for me, it's very important to have a little bit of leeway and not plot out everything in fine detail, because when I tend to do that, it becomes boring for me, writing in general. So I like being surprised a little bit, because sometimes when you leave that little bit of room for yourself, I find that you can even add in a twist or two and be surprised yourself. There's a saying, right? No laughter in the author, no laughter in the reader, no tears in the author, no tears in the reader. So it's the same thing with surprise. If I'm not surprised, chances are you're not going to be surprised either. So that's why I like to have both plotting and pantsing.
Fantastic. Adan, what's your sort of system for creating fantasy worlds and fantasy stories?
Well, so I definitely wrote the first book just without any outline, just sort of exploring and seeing where it went, which was really, really fun. But the second book, because I'd set up all these plot lines that I actually had to like follow through on, I did do a bit more of an outline on that, so I wouldn't miss anything really important. But yeah, I love world building. And I think the early drafts of my books are just like the characters moving through like this exciting fantasy space and this and fantasy space, and descriptions of all the different like daggers that the assassin has that are a part of her body. And then, you know, on the second draft, it's like, okay, you actually need to have plot. So we should probably make sure there's a story. It's not just look at this cool world I created. But I do start with the setting.
Fantastic. Let's bounce to a question from the audience here. What is the hardest part for you about being an author? Adam, do you want to go first for that one?
Sure, that's a really good question. I'd love more time to think about it, but I think what initially comes to mind is, as a kid, when I fantasized about being an author, you know, I didn't really get past writing, the idea of writing a book. It was like, wow, this will be amazing. And, you know, now I'm an adult and I have written books, and there's a lot more to it than just writing the book. And for me, I struggle with the, you know, like having a social media presence and needing to promote the book. I'm actually fairly shy. So this is great. It's nice talking to readers. But any kind of like posting publicly feels very like vulnerable and stressful. So I do struggle with that sort of side of it.
And Tanaz?
Yeah, actually, I totally relate to that, what you just said, because I feel like there is always the marketing aspect of being an author, which is like, you know, when you start writing a book, you're just writing. So you're basically just a writer. And then when you're published, you're the quote unquote author, and you have to do all these things where you're supposed to be the face of your book, you're marketing the book, and you're doing all these other things, like you have to talk about it and you have to learn to be shameless about it. It's a hard lesson. Okay, this is my fourth book, so this is a very hard lesson I've had to learn for my fourth book. I started doing it now, not when I first got published. So let me tell you, it takes a lot of time for those shameless genes to emerge. It will emerge at some point, you know. I used to be very shy too.
Thank you.
So that's going to happen at some point or another. But you know what? The main thing you need to remember is that, yes, it is tough doing these things, but you should also be very, very proud of the fact that you have written this amazing book, and that, you've put in all that time and energy into these characters who are really, really cool and badass. The world needs to know about them. So it's like, if you don't believe in your book, no one else is going to. So go on, read our books. Come on. What's stopping you?
Thank you so much.
A follow-up from the audience as well. In terms of the sort of, I guess, author side as opposed to the writer side, do you have any tips for making querying easier? That whole process.
Okay, I'll go first for this one. Basically, there are sites where you can look up examples of query letters. For example, there's, I think, Query Shark. It used to be a blog run by an anonymous literary agent, and if you Google it, you'll still find an archive of it online, I believe. But it basically shows examples of query letters, real query letters that people have sent out, and the agent actually critiqued them. So you will get to see how people send out and how they structure their letters and how they send them out. The biggest tip I can give you, apart from knowing how to structure a query letter, is basically, when you get one rejection, send out 10 more submissions. That used to be my process. I sent out about 150 something queries before I landed an agent. Just so you know, that's a typical number of people you have to query before you get any breakthrough. But the main thing is to make sure that, one, you have a complete manuscript. Please have a complete manuscript. Don't just query with 1 or 2 chapters. Complete it, finish your whole book, make sure it's polished. Secondly, when you're writing, make sure your query letter is short. It's 3 paragraphs only. The first 2 should introduce your book. The last one should introduce you and why you're the best person to write the book. You can talk about any writing awards that you've won, competitions, for example, or if you've gotten any literary grants from the Ontario Arts Council, Canada Council for the Arts, something like that. Or even if you don't have any of those things, you can just talk about your background, because at the end of the day, what's in here is going to be the most important thing, because your book has to be good, period. No jokes about that. If this is not good, nobody's going to sign you on.
Very thorough. Thank you.
That was really good advice. I think maybe what I'll then say is, I had a Excel document tracking all of my queries. So I could say, okay, this is where I've sent it. Is there a response? Yes, no. If I didn't, what was the response? So you will want to track that, especially because you will get a lot of rejections and you'll be sending it out to a lot of different people. There's no way you'll be able to remember all of that. And then I'll just say, I think dealing with the rejection, prepare to be rejected a lot. So think of that as part of the process. So I try to do this thing where, when I would get a rejection, I'd be like, okay, I'm one step closer, right? Because I need to go through 50, 60, 80 rejections. So this is part of it. Or I send it out and I celebrate having sent it out. And I get a response, any response, and I celebrate it. So maybe do that as well, and know that it does take time.
It's definitely a process, from everything I have heard over the years from all of my word on the street authors. So checking questions. Back to kind of the more writerly side of things. What inspires you as a writer? Are there other books that you've read that just kind of gripped you, either when you were younger or more recently? Are there fantasy worlds in film or TV or anything like that just kind of light a spark and make you want to go create things? What are your influences and what are your inspirations? Adan?
Sure. I mean, so many things. Lots of books. I read all the time. I love reading other fantasy books, especially YA fantasy books. Anna Marie McLemore, they are one of my favorite authors right now. So that's my shout out. And I'm also, I think, sort of inspired by the things that I'm passionate about and care about in my everyday life, right? So things like social justice and queer love and queer families, and thinking about the kinds of books that I want to read, that I wanted to read when I were younger, and definitely that I still want to read. and wanting to make those stories, wanting to have those stories, and then as always, needing to wrap that in magic, because magic is really fun, and I'm a kid and love that. And then there's other, in terms of like settings, I always want my settings to be like weird and interesting. So, I feel like I get inspiration from everywhere. Like I like going to secondhand stores and seeing all of the objects in there and seeing, oh, how could I use these objects or throw them together in an interesting way, so that the setting isn't just like my house castle-y.
And Tanaz, what are your influences and inspirations when you're writing or creating?
I have a lot of inspirations as well. So I definitely read a ton of books. I'm really getting into adult fantasy right now. I recently read Black Sun by Rebecca Bonehorse, which is this fantasy inspired by pre-Columbian indigenous cultures. And it's an amazing book, really, really fantastic, about a crow god. And it's like, it is just so cool. You just have to read it. It's just amazing. I'm also reading Tasha Suri's books, which I really, really like. Jasmine Throne, which is a queer romance set in an ancient in India-inspired setting. Even the map that they've given for the book is really, really the ancient India type of maps that they used to make back in the day. It's like a flower, not a typical country or landscape that we're really aware of now as modern readers. So it's really that sort of map. It's really, really fantastic, and I'm really loving that book as well. I'm really drawn by history these days. For me, my passion is history, and especially medieval history. So I can go off on like this real YouTube what's that word? I'm forgetting the word, but anyway.
Down a rabbit hole, kind of.
Rabbit hole, yes, that's the word I'm forgetting. I'm going down a rabbit hole where I'm like kind of like going into the fact that, okay, let's look at medieval weapons and fights, and then I'm suddenly looking up medieval jewelry and like, oh, this is what they used to wear, like, back in the day. And I'm just like totally any kind of thing that can draw inspiration from even modern objects, like Adan mentioned. I can tell you that there's a chandelier in Hunted by the Sky that was inspired by an actual light fixture at Moxie's, the restaurant. So I'm not even joking how that kind of made it into my ancient Indian fantasy book. So that's the kind of thing that happens all the time when you're doing fantasy. Like you to look at ordinary objects in real life, and then you kind of think, oh, how can I make this 10 times cooler? Right? And that's what you're thinking about whenever you're writing fantasy, whenever you're looking at real life situations. So sometimes even contemporary books, you can be inspired even to write contemporary fiction just by looking at real life, by sitting on the TTC and listening to the ding, 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 and then something goes in, and then, okay, a new story emerges, and then suddenly a zombie enters. You can think of many things. You're always thinking, you're always getting inspired, you're eavesdropping on conversations. That's what we do, right, as authors.
Fantastic. So has this public transit eavesdropping led you to any new stories, i.e. what is next in your writing? What are you excited about that you'd like to share?
I can't share too much right now. I am working on something else set in the same universe, but not the same kingdom. That is all I can talk about right now until I finish that rewrite.
Excellent. So more fantasy, though. Excellent. Adan, what are you excited about? What are you working on? If you can talk.
I am working on a new book series, and yeah, it's an urban fantasy. I'm still struggling with is it YA or adult? I'm kind of in the middle right now, so I'll have to do some edits there. But yeah, I think it'll appeal to people who they like stories about found families. They like magic that's really like enchanting and like fun, and you want to do it. Social justice, things like that. So I am really, really excited about it and had a really fun time doing it. I get my partner to like read parts of it aloud to me, and then we like bond over it.
Sounds lovely, especially the cozy Canadian winter sort of reading evenings. That's a good thing to do. You mentioned audience there. that it's a tricky thing. I think for me as a teen librarian, a lot of the things that are coming at me from publishers, especially right now, they're like, "This is a YA book." I'm like, "The character is 22 and in med school. What? No, no, this is just adult fiction, not for teenagers." And there's also kind of been a bit of a shift I've found with YA where they're almost wanting it to appeal more to the adult reader of YA as opposed to the actual teens that I feel should be the audience of a YA or a teen book. Is that Adan, you mentioned with the news story, you're not quite sure where it's going to land. Is that something that you're considering when you're starting to write, or does that come more naturally as the story and the writing progress?
I'm sure my agent would be happier if I said I had planned it out at the beginning, but I just wrote the story that I was really excited about writing. This is what I did during COVID when everything was awful and I like didn't do as much. I should have done more postdoc work, but instead I wrote this book. Yeah, because the character's like 18, 19, but I would love to write a few books as they'll like get into their 20s, which to me feels like adult. But my style, I think maybe part of my style still feels kind of YA. So yes, I'm sure in my edits we'll have to make a judgment call and decide which one it is, and then change it.
Those threshold ages are always the tricky point. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Tanaz, your thoughts on audience and how you determine who a book may ultimately appeal to?
This is a very good question, and I'd like to know the answer to this as well, because I'll be very frank. My first book was written, A Girl Like That was a contemporary novel, which was written for adults. And when we tried to sell it, adult publishers wouldn't buy it. They said it was too dark. It ultimately ended up selling to a YA publisher who didn't find it as dark for whatever reason. And this book, mostly because I had a lot of teen characters, it sold in the YA market. And since then, I enjoy writing for teenagers, and I enjoy the YA voice as well. It's really kind of challenging sometimes because, you're sort of also writing for teens, but you're also writing for was something that their parents would approve of. And certain times what happens is that you have to kind of adjust your the level of what you are supposed to be writing and kind of make changes. Many times I will have like this sort of like this tiff with my editor where she'll be like, do you need this swear word in there? And I'm like, it's not something that's unusual. Teens do swear. It's not like it's an unusual thing. So it's that sort of thing that's kind of common. But in general, it's kind of hard to say it because the last few books that I have been written intentionally with teens in mind. So when I started writing Hunted by the Sky and Rising Like a Storm, I wrote them knowing I was writing from the perspective of teenage characters. And so sometimes when I get a critical review which says, these characters sound so much like teenagers, I'm like, yeah, that's because that's who they are, right? And it's usually an adult reviewer who will be complaining about this, that this character is acting so immature. And I'm like, you know what, it's like that's a stage we all have gone through. We all have been immature at some stage in our lives. It's not like we're all like grown up as, or we weren't born as 40 or 50-year olds, right? So that's the whole point of it. So I think it's really kind of challenging, and I really like what you said earlier, is that our teen novels skewing more for the adult audiences. It's really kind of tricky because it sometimes feels like there are certain fantasy novels where they're almost like a crossover. So it's really kind of challenging because when you sell them, you end up selling them in the YA category. Or sometimes you will notice a lot of adult female fantasy writers are also shelved into the YA category, which is really unusual because the characters are clearly in their 20s or 30s, and and you see them in the teen market, and you wonder, why is this happening? Are they is this a marketing ploy? Where are the books for actual teenagers? And I think if people want to read about it. Nicole Brinkley wrote an amazing article about this. You can look it up online. It's really fantastic because there are really lots of thoughts that goes back into the history of YA and really goes in depth into how YA is transitioning from something that used to be for teens to more for adults, because adults are becoming a huge part of the market. So it's something really interesting to look into.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Can I jump in there?
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I feel like, historically, and this is probably true of all genres, but I think fantasy, adult fantasy, had a very like problem with being so like white and masculine. And YA really developed as like a genre, I think, aimed more at girls, and actually has made space for more diversity. So I think there is like, I know obviously authors have broken into adult fantasy, and like, famous authors like N.K. Jemisin come to mind, who are absolutely amazing. But I feel like there's still a bit of a feeling about adult fantasy, or I'm not sure about the actual publishing industry. But I remember a few years ago, my friend said, well, okay, if you have an 18-year-old, are they in adult fantasy or YA? And I said, well, what's the gender of the character? Because the 18-year-old boy is like a man, and he's going to have adventures in the adult, and the girl's going to be like in the teenage section.
That's very true. Yeah. Definitely something that I see when I'm buying for my collections. Yeah. Depressing, but true. I don't know. Awesome. Well, thanks to your publishers, I have copies of books to give away to audience members. So if you are an audience member, what you need to do is send me an email. I don't have a way, unfortunately, of typing out my email address for you right now in the webinar, but it is page.mcgeorge@letlib.ca. So it's PAIGEORGE@LETHLIB.ca. So Paige McGeorge@letlib.ca. Fire me an email. Tell me that you came to see the wonderful fantasy Word on the Street session and you would like to win a book. If you are a real live teenager, as opposed to an adult who loves YA books and fantasy, I am going to prioritize teen readers for the giveaway. So, self-identify yourself as a teen in the email. Grown-ups, though, do send me emails as well, because I will put you in the draw, and you never know. I have different numbers of copies of different people's books, so you might get something anyhow. Thank you to both of the lovely authors for joining me this afternoon. It was so fun to talk to you and hear about the worlds that you have created and the characters that you have stuck into those worlds. I hope everybody picks up your books, either from the library or, like I said, from the University of Lethbridge bookstore, our official seller for Word on the Street. And hopefully, like I said, someday we can bring you to actual Lethbridge.
Thank you
so much for having us.
Have a great weekend, everybody. We have one more session of teen author greatness this afternoon. Our next one starts at 4:15, so about 10 minutes from now, and it is our mystery and murder section. So if you need to find out about some dramatic and possibly thrilling YA books, this will be the one to pop in and listen to. I'll see you all in 10, and have a great rest of your week.